Hello everyone, and welcome to the Goodwill Meditation Group webinar. And today it's Wednesday, the 25th of November. My name's Dominic Dibble, and I work in the London Centre. And today I'm going to be joined by my colleague Michael Galloway from New York. He will be presenting some thoughts after our meditation about towards a point of emergence. Excuse me. Which will be following up on some thoughts from the World Goodwill Seminar, which happened on the 14th of November. But before we do that, we're going to focus upon the Goodwill meditation, which we're going to do shortly. And as many of you probably know, the Goodwill Meditation Group is a worldwide group of people who link up each Wednesday at noon to meditate on goodwill. This group aims to stimulate and strengthen the goodwill that is expressed by humanity as a whole. And we meet on the last Wednesday of each month. And this meeting provides a platform for individuals to come together, to use this goodwill meditation, and to discuss the work of goodwill. Goodwill has been described as love in action, and it exists in all human relationships that carry a note of loving intention. It is a positive and dynamic energy, and it can be consciously used for the betterment of humanity and all the kingdoms of nature. It is, in essence, the name we give to the potent energy of divine will as it is expressed through human relationship. And this powerful energy can overcome all separating forces and has the potential to transform all aspects of our societies and the planet itself. The energy of goodwill redeems, unifies, and reveals the essential goodness underlying all phenomena. The existence of goodwill is evidence of the link between humanity, the spiritual hierarchy, and the divine. So now I'm going to turn off my video and we're going to go into our meditation together on the energy of goodwill. And before we begin, let's recall that we are sharing this effort with thousands of other people of goodwill around the planet. And remember that essentially we are souls, and as such we have telepathic rapport with all souls. And we are using this meditation as a positive, creative use of the mind, actively linking the inner and outer worlds. Through our creative imagination, we can see ourselves at one with all humanity and with all that is progressive, spiritual, and working for human welfare and right human relations. link up in thought with all those people throughout the world who are working with this goodwill meditation. Reflect upon the fact of relationship. We're related to our family, our local community, our nation, the world of nations. We are related to, finally, the one humanity made up of all peoples and nations. We use the mantra of unification. The souls of all are one, and I am one with them. I seek to love, not hate. I seek to serve, and not exact due service. I seek to heal, not hurt. Let pain bring due reward of light and love. Let the soul control the outer form and life and all events, and bring to light the love that underlies the happenings of the time. Let vision come and insight. Let the future stand revealed. Let inner union demonstrate and outer cleavages be gone. Let love prevail. Let all people love. Reflect upon your own and humanity's relationship with all beings who dwell in the higher realms of mind and heart, the spiritual hierarchy known as by many names as saints, as rishis, bodhisattvas, and masters, honored by all the world's faiths and spiritual groups. Imagine that you are standing together within the center of the spiritual hierarchy, immersed in the consciousness of the heart of love. For some, this heart of love is known as the Christ, while other faiths have other names for the one at the center, such as Maitreya, the Imam Mahdi, and the Kalki avatar. Maintaining that high point of contact, let your thoughts reach out to include all members of the human family in whom the energy of goodwill is active. We use the affirmation. In the center of all love, I stand. From that center, I, the soul, will outward move. From that center, I, the one who serves, will work. May the love of the divine self be shed abroad in my heart, through my group, and throughout the world. Visualize the energy of love flowing from the spiritual hierarchy through all people of goodwill into human hearts and minds, infusing them with goodwill and creating loving and harmonious human relationships. Meditate on ways of spreading goodwill, creating right human relationships, and thus restoring peace on earth. Realize that you are helping to build a channel between the spiritual hierarchy and humanity, through which the energy of goodwill may flow, uniting humanity, solving its problems, and healing all differences and cleavages. linked in thought with people of goodwill all over the world, we say together the great invocation with deliberation and full commitment to its meaning. From the point of light within the mind of God, let light stream forth into human minds. Let light descend on earth. From the point of love within the heart of God, let love stream forth into human hearts. May the coming one return to earth. From the center where the will of God is known, let purpose guide all little human wills, the purpose which the masters know and serve. From the center which we call the human race, let the plan of love and light work out, and may it seal the door where evil dwells. Let light and love and power restore the plan on earth. Thanks everyone for your participation. And now it's my great pleasure to hand over to Michael to invite him to share his thoughts on Towards a Point of Emergence. Over to you, Michael. I'll disappear.
Thank you, Dominic. Thank you. So as Dominic said, I'd like to speak today about some of the ideas that were introduced at the World Goodwill Seminar, which took place a week and a half ago on November 14th. To restate the title, it was The Spiritual Dynamics of Crisis on the Path of Global Cooperation. And the premise of this theme, which looked at two things, spiritual dynamics of crisis and global cooperation as it's developing in the life of humanity, it looks at this theme from the perspective that today humanity faces a profound spiritual crisis, and one which is fundamentally a crisis of relationships at all levels. This crisis of relationship is also a crisis which concerns the next step forward of humanity's path, of humanity's progress upon the path of evolution. And this forward progress upon this path requires a movement in consciousness. It requires a movement in thought, which parallels movement in action. The need is to transform all aspects of human living. So during the seminar, there were presentations, discussions, and meditations were held which evoked numerous ideas, and I'd like to just briefly highlight the 10 major ideas that were brought up at all 3 broadcasts of the seminar in London, Geneva, and New York. But then more importantly, I'd like to lead us in a discussion about where this path of global cooperation is leading us. There is crisis, it's being brought to a point of tension today, but what is that point of emergence? So really, what is the vision of the future? And so we will discuss that after this brief presentation. So the first major idea is the fact of the soul. As many of us know, the soul is what bridges all levels of consciousness from the very highest to the lowest. The soul is the agent of evolution. It's what moves all things forward upon that path. And it does this through the perfecting of the relationship between spirit and the forms which give it a vehicle of expression. That which is spiritual, therefore, is anything which moves us forward upon the path of evolution, towards expanded consciousness, towards understanding, towards greater wholeness. And this is both individually and in humanity as a whole. So the existence of the soul at individual, national, and international levels was discussed, including its nature. What is the nature of a national soul, for instance? How is it evoked? And what responsibility does that bestow? Also discussed was the new group of world servers, a term some of us here are familiar with, surely. That group is the group of those who have made at least some degree of alignment with their soul. So they are vertically aligned with that source of light and love, and they are horizontally oriented servers, which seek to bridge between humanity and between the spiritual hierarchy, which is the planetary soul. The second major idea, the energy of the will. Today, certain unique spiritual energies are impacting the planet and humanity. These energies stimulate humanity's will to good and its will to love, and in turn, the will to cooperate. However, as part of this stimulation, these energies also disturb and stimulate aspects of humanity and perhaps individuals, of course, that are unresolved. These aspects of the human psyche which have not yet been redeemed. And this gives rise to a multitude of crises in humanity as economic, political, and social. The third major idea is the universality of spirituality. The fact that what is spiritual is should be considered in a universal sense, and also that the path of evolution is diverse. And what this means is that spirituality encompasses all sectors of human living, whether it's someone raising a family, whether it's a young child growing into adulthood, whether it's somebody taking up an explicitly mystical or religious or spiritual path, or whether it's something as mundane as studying at university. All of these can be considered spiritual if, for that individual or group, they move them forward upon the path of evolution towards greater understanding. And there is also, therefore, recognition that the path of evolution is diverse, with different individuals and groups at different stages upon that path, and this must be understood in order to approach all sectors and all individuals with understanding. There also is, of course, a recognition that humanity itself is at a very peculiar and particular stage upon that path. The fourth major idea, the right handling of duality. At the New York seminar, someone asked whether we should follow the better angels of our nature, which means to throw the entire weight of ourselves upon the side of the good, or whether we should instead seek to tread the middle razor-edged path of the Buddha. And I think this is a question that a lot of people have. It was suggested that perhaps both paths are in fact the same, or at least maybe they're not opposed to one another. The middle razor-edged path, of course, perhaps means cooperation with those better angels. And to quote Steve Nation in his opening talk, he said, quote, "Instead of outright rejecting the forces opposing cooperation, we are driven to understand these forces as aspects of ourselves and our own nations." The fifth major idea is the recognition of inequality. There is a recognition of the accelerating gap between rich and poor, occurs both transnationally across nations and also within many countries as well. And this issue is apparently being brought to a point of tension. Jimena Leiva-Roche, who spoke at New York, brought up the interesting point that the global pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, has for the first time alerted those in developed countries to the fragility of human civilization. Often those in the more developed countries are not so affected by world crises. The sixth major idea is the nature of crisis. First, that crisis is cyclic, meaning it occurs in stages of crisis, tension, and emergence, and this ultimately propels the individual or the group forward upon the path of evolution. Many at all the conferences, or at several of the seminars, expressed that there is a need to allow time to resolve certain crises. And often solutions take time to work out, and so the time factor, although maybe imminent in one sense, should not be ignored. Crisis as a spiritual opportunity was also discussed. Crisis eventually forces decisions to be made, and there is a need for understanding in order to make the right choice that therefore moves to the right point of emergence, rather than a resolution back to the status quo. In Geneva, Alexandra Masako Gusens Ishii explained how the climate crisis is bringing about a sort of crisis of spiritual opportunity. She said that the climate crisis is, quote, has the potential to trigger unprecedented solidarity and action on a global scale and enable human beings to profoundly transform their attitude towards themselves and their human and natural environment, end quote. The seventh major idea is the need for education. In London, several people expressed the need for a type of education which trains the minds and hearts of young people to unfold the identity of their souls, of the soul. There should be more emphasis upon world citizenship, upon global responsibility, and upon a culture based upon the essential unity of life. When this is taught from an early age, it blossoms forth into a sort of civilizational-wide understanding later in life. The eighth major idea is how to address fear and to bring hope. This idea was prevalent throughout the conference. In Geneva, particularly Thubten Wangchen, a Tibetan Buddhist monk, urged the need for patience. The UN was also central to many discussions. The UN, of course, remains a source of hope and also a source of hope for many, and also means for the right handling of human crises. The UN is a place for discussion, for the exchange of ideas. And in Geneva, it was highlighted that the UN is a place for thought form building to prevent conflicts otherwise would be fought out on the physical plane. The ninth major idea, the need for communication between those with differing ideologies, between small and large countries. In echoing the movement at the UN, there was an express need for bottom-up solutions and not just top-down. Those at local levels often understand better what those communities need in order to thrive and become better and to better serve their citizens. In London, Dr. A.T. Aryaratne and Dr. Charika Marasinghe spoke about the work of the Sarvodaya movement in Sri Lanka, which uses Gandhian and Buddhist principles and practices to build no poverty, no wealth communities within some of the poorest villages in the country. This movement has been tremendously successful. In New York, Ahmad Kiaye highlighted the work that non-state actors play in bringing together influential actors to negotiate global treaties. He spoke about particularly his group's work on bringing together actors to negotiate a treaty on the elimination of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. The 10th major idea, and the last one which I will enumerate here, is the vision of the future. In London, Christine Morgan spoke on regional parliaments and the vision that some form of UN Parliamentary Assembly, many are today and have for some time been talking about, if it existed, would bring a greater degree of democratic representation to global governance. Importantly, all three seminars concluded with the same meditation, which used the following keynote. It says, today, conflicts are numerous, vital, and unavoidable, presenting constant points of crises and bringing about a point of world tension. But ahead of humanity lies a point of emergence. And it is this point of emergence which constitutes, of course, our goal and towards which all servers in every sector of human living and who work for the good of the whole are today striving. And what is good, and I think, in my opinion, leaves it reasonable to be optimistic about the future, is that today humanity is definitely responding to this vision of wholeness, which we know is bestowed by humanity's soul, the impending energy of the soul. At the same time, of course, humanity remains bound to the past, and so the sort of predicament of our age as we stand between the Piscean age, which is preeminently the age of the individual, one can say, and the age of Aquarius, which is the age of the group, is that we are sort of equally pulled between both of these forces. This creates, of course, an intensity of psychological conflict, but one which will ultimately be resolved when humanity makes the right decision. So before moving into the discussion, I'd just like to invite perhaps London or anybody else that from the seminars who would like to just share a few thoughts or a few additional thoughts that I may have missed that I think were important about the seminars. And if not, we'll just move into the discussion.
Well, speaking from London, I think you have provided us with plenty to think about, and as you mentioned, the Sarvodaya Shramadana movement, which we were very privileged to have presenting in the form of both father and daughter. They've been going for a long, long time. They're actually about the same age as World Goodwill, which is kind of a coincidence. because Dr. Ariyaratne was born just the year before World Goodwill was first created. And there's been quite a long association between the two groups, actually, through various personal contacts. And it's quite inspiring that one of the points that was made by the two speakers was that basically they start from principles. They don't go into a village and say, right, you need to sort out, you know, your drinking water or your nutrition or so on. They start from principles, and they only get to the practical point at kind of the third stage of the process. And the other thing which was quite inspiring, which was shared, was that they start from the village. It is a bottom up process, so to speak, but their view, because it encompasses or it uses the Buddhist principles, encompasses a vision that ultimately extends to the planet and to cosmic principles, as it were. So there's a very strong resonance, I think, between the two points of view of World Goodwill and Sarvodaya. And I'm going to stop wittering on now. And I think, do we have anyone who would like to share their thoughts? If you haven't done it before, the process for doing that is you go into the participants list and you can raise your hand. And if you raise your hand, we'll unmute you and invite you to make your contribution. And if there's anyone from Geneva, as Michael said, it'd be lovely to hear from them.
Thanks, Dominic. While waiting for people, what you said about the Sarvodaya Institute reminded me of something that Alice Bailey wrote in her book Education in the New Age. She wrote that the two things that which all children should be taught from an earliest age are the fact of the one humanity and the value of the individual. And it seems like what's really interesting is they really take the esoteric approach, and that you said they start with principles. They work from the universals to the particulars. And that's not often how people approach things, but it really is the way esotericism works. But also in alignment with, I guess, the need of the individual, they start at the local level and look at that. So it's a beautiful way of kind of combining both of those principles, which seem like opposites and sort of a paradox, but actually aren't, don't need to be. It's really beautiful.
And another thing that you said, which I think was quite interesting, is, of course, that they work with a no poverty, no riches kind of perspective. And I suppose, in a sense, what we were basically turning the whole idea of poverty on its head, because it's not about material wealth so much as spiritual wealth. The kind of interesting thing that Dr. Ariyaratne shared was that their voluntary efforts are running at a profit even during the coronavirus pandemic. Not because they want to run at a profit, but because they're so soundly based, as it were.
Looks like Steve is here.
Oh yes, he's got his hand up. Steve.
Hey, that was beautiful. Thank you, Michael. That was a really beautiful summary, and thanks, Dom. It's very interesting reflecting on the seminars, and a couple of thoughts. First, just in response to Sarvodaya, one of the things that to me is so impressive about Sarvodaya is scale, because we don't have a lot of examples of goodwill movements that are working at such scale. So in Sri Lanka, Sarvodaya is the largest by far civil society movement working at social development, and very actively engaged in over 3,000 villages. So it is working with millions of people. And that it's really important to take that on board, to my mind, because it does mean that we rethink about instead of thinking about small fringe movements or pressure groups, we start thinking about movements that are actually changing the quality of relationships within thousands of communities, of neighborhoods. And that's really, to me, that's interesting. The other thing that interests me about the New York event was to see this path to cooperation through the eyes of the 4 panelists, each of whom was speaking from a sort of professional basis. One from the reflection in terms of a government negotiator at the UN and what negotiation means, and how negotiation is becoming more goodwill oriented and more centered in heart, but also with skill. Another speaker who represented an international civil servant, having worked at the UN for many, many years, spoke of how within the whole context of the path to cooperation, the UN Secretariat can play a very positive, dynamic role and bring in the will. So really highlight and hold before governments and civil society the will to achieve the goals that the UN was set up for. And then a civil society, a professional sort of civil society representation from 2 people, one from the Middle East and the elimination of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East, showing actually how the incredibly positive role that civil society can play. So instead of thinking of it as some airy-fairy thing, seeing that the actual treaty around which Middle East governments cautiously are quietly talking is better able to be devised by civil society, people with experience in treaty planning and from civil society, were better able to do that than governments. And then finally, from the Baha'is, but more specifically from the growing alliances within civil society, showing how civil society really is taking on board the humanity making deeper choices. So to me, those were really interesting thoughts. And then the other thing that interests me about your comment, Michael, your talk, is in this theme of emergence. So it would be really interesting to hear on reflections on what emergence means. We're often so idealistic, and we think, so the comments are always abstract. So what emergence could we expect out of this coronavirus and all the intersecting crises that go into that, and a total political reorientation which comes through a change of government in the US, because that changes the political dynamics. So if you think in the past we've had a point of emergence of the formation of the UN after the crisis of the Second World War, then we had a point of emergence after the end of the fall of the Berlin Wall. We're moving to a new point of emergence post-COVID and suddenly an earthquake in the sort of political dynamics of international relations. And to me, that's an interesting question.
Aha. There's a lot to chew upon there, Steve. And we have another hand up from George Knox. I'll ask him to unmute.
Good morning or afternoon or evening. My question really relates to the apparently overwhelming absence of trust between players, primarily in the United States of America and primarily around the facade of politics, which conceals a much deeper level of fear based upon an absence of trust. And so as we speak about emergence, what is the ingredient? What is the means by which it can be accomplished by cooperation that is only effective when people are sincerely and honestly committed, and between themselves there's a common purpose that makes trust the norm rather than the extraordinarily rare exception. And it relates, I think, to the question of conciliation of what we are now calling tribes, in the sense that the diaspora, the post-slavery diaspora, has zero faith in the word Pharaoh-like that it receives from those who have historically been identified as oppressors, who are now exercising power and resistance to change. So that was the question.
It's a tough one. I think one of the things that was touched upon in London, what you said about an absence of trust, is that there's a great need to understand other people, to find a way of bridging through understanding, because it's only through understanding we can really begin to trust. And the key to all of this, of course, is goodwill. The simple magical ingredient. If we don't have that goodwill, then we can't even make that first step of attempting to understand, and attempting to trust. And as you say, that there are these cleavages, this polarization that exists, and that's the hard work that we have to do. We have to find ways to channel goodwill into these situations. And as Steve has noted, that's happening at the UN. It's happening in other places. Can you hear me, by the way? My voice is...
I can hear you.
Oh,
fine.
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And so that's my first little sketch of a kind of direction one might move in if you want to try and emerge from this situation of low trust and polarization, that we need to find ways creatively to apply, energize goodwill. And that can be from the smallest incident of just sharing a smile with somebody, all the way up to international negotiations. And the two are the same thing, really. They're all about building bridges. But it's not easy. It's certainly not easy. And we are in a situation where for some time now that there has been something of a breakdown in trust. Now, I see there's a couple of more hands up. I'm going to invite, first of all, Lucis Trust Geneva to say something. That's probably Minsa.
Yeah, that's Minsa. I hope you hear me. Yeah, talking about trust, I think it's a good topic. In Geneva, it has been touched upon from a Tibetan perspective by Thubten Wancheng, who is a member of the Tibetan parliament in exile. And one of the keys is patience. Michael alluded already to that. I think patience is a very important thing, and it gives you the opportunity to see things in a wider perspective. Things which are emerging, Steve already mentioned a couple of them. I think one important thing is the notion of the Sustainable Development Goals. That is a track which is aiming at something around 2030. So it is something which is emerging, and this cannot emerge if there wouldn't be what we would call goodwill, or that cannot emerge if there won't be a mutual trust between the nations, because the Sustainable Development Goals is not a question of the United States, it's not a question of the UK, it's a question of all the nations. This draft has been signed by all the members of the United Nations, including the United States and including all the other nations. So I think this is an example of something that is emerging, and I think we could keep that in mind.
Absolutely. And certainly World Goodwill places quite a strong emphasis upon the various different ways in which the Sustainable Development Goals are being implemented by thousands of civil society organizations around the world in very innovative ways. So it's something we do want to keep an eye on. And I notice we have another hand, which is Kit Flourish. I'll ask you to unmute.
Yes, well, it's Kit Tur, and I'm in Washington, D.C. And maybe you can help me find the question in this, because I feel like there is one, but I'm not sure how to say it. But that is that looking in my own nation, there seems to be, there's a real need for both and. So for example, I'm involved in different things that try and bring together people across the political spectrum so that we can listen to each other and more understand each other. And at the same time, our country is really now in a crisis, and it's in a crisis of the state of our democracy and the future of our democracy through decisions being made around our voting, and trust is huge there. So I guess my question or comment is, it seems that there also, while we're looking at what's for the future, we really also have to, in addition to goodwill and understanding, address directly certain, crises in democracy and things.
Thanks, Kit. Can I say something, Dominic, really quick
Sure.
in response to that, and also a little bit in response to what George said.
Mhm.
That's that I think this issue of trust is really important, as you said, as both of you said. And I think it's easy to look at the political problems, but we have to remember that they are reflective of larger social problems. And George, what you mentioned, the vestiges of slavery and the post-slavery diaspora. What that is, and what's so horrible is that there is sort of, what it creates is a sort of attachment to what's happened in the past, but people can't move beyond that until there is, like you said, a reconciliation. And I think, relating that also to the election crisis, what it has to do with fundamentally is this sort of, like I mentioned earlier, finding some way to resolve that past in order to move into the future. And so, I don't know, of course, what the what's needed for that, but really resolving what it is that hasn't been resolved from our past, I think is really key to moving into this point of emergence. I had another thought, but I totally lost it. So let's just leave it at that.
I think that's certainly a point I would agree with, that we need to learn to recognize that every society has committed crimes, has done terrible things, and we need to find ways to reconcile with that past and intelligently and in cooperation with those who've been wronged. And it's interesting that to some extent has, particularly during the pandemic, has come up as a thing in human consciousness. There was a debate in the UK, particularly about statues and how what they represent, which was quite intriguing, because, well, certainly around the Lucis Trust offices in London, there's lots of statues, and there are lots of statues of military men, and it makes you wonder, what does that mean for a society where public space is occupied by lots of statues of military men, and celebrating, or supposedly celebrating, victories over different peoples at different times, and how we reflect on how has that shaped the collective consciousness of a nation, because we talked again about the soul of a nation and the personality of a nation, and how do we bring forward the soul of the nation and goodwill. There's lots of comments in the chat as well, which we haven't even touched upon. There was a point earlier about education for empathy. There was some comments about weapons and disarmament, and how finding disarmament, well, moving towards disarmament, which was, in fact, I believe, it was Ahmad Kai spoke about that in New York. Sorry, the pronunciation is bound to be wrong. And what else is there? People are talking about also about how mistrust tends to be based on fear. And this again goes back to what we're saying about reconciling with the past, because the fear that was created by the violence that was inflicted, that's still somehow in the collective consciousness of peoples. And how do we cast out that fear? Well, again, the answer is love casts out fear, goodwill casts out fear. But it's a very simple thing to say, a very hard thing to do. And we're running over time, but I mean, again, we could talk more, I'm sure, about lots of these topics. But at the same time, we can always do the same thing next time. Although I believe you were going to say something, Michael, about our final meeting of the year, which is probably going to be, well, I'll leave that to you.
Oh, just to announce that because our next seminar is on December 30th, it's close to a holiday. I just wanted to let everybody know that we will still be having that, I said seminar, but I meant to say webinar, that our final webinar in December on December 30th will be held. That's all I wanted to say. Just to let everybody know. Same time, same place.
Same time, same place.
But also, I mean, just to reiterate, though, that this Goodwill Meditation Group does meet every week at 12 o'clock in your local time zone. We meet subjectively. Everyone throughout the world have been using this meditation for many, many decades, every Wednesday at noon in their local time zone. And that's really the true group, is that subjective meeting in meditation. This webinar is just to kind of vocalize us and give us a place to discuss on the physical plane, but really please join us every week in meditation.
Amen. And I think at this point we will just close our meeting with a few moments of silence, and dwelling upon holidays that are coming up and the new year that's coming up, and perhaps there is light at the end of some of the tunnels that we've been in for a while. So let's dwell upon how we can use goodwill to help light the way for a few moments. Thanks again, everyone, for your participation. As Michael says, we can join in every week subjectively, but our next opportunity for a physical, cyber meeting is on December 30th. So we hope to see you then. Bye for now.